I want to tell you the story of one of the most kindest women who's ever lived in Ireland. And this is the story of Mary O'Rourke. Now, Mary was such a sweet and kind woman. She lived in a modest little home on a little patch of land at the edge of a village. And she lived there with her husband, Pat, who she loved more than anything in the world. And Pat felt the same way about her. But Pat worked hard. His job was mending farm machinery, so he'd travel all around Ireland, and he had a set route that he'd follow. So while he was gone for months at a time, Mary always knew where he was going to be, and she used to write him letters. Now, these were letters that you and I would find boring. She just described, going about her day. She kept herself busy while he was away by making extra food for the local church and mending clothes and spending time with some of the local young women, helping them with their reading and their writing. But Mary was such a selfless person. She's the type of person who, if she was cold in the house, she'd never think to light a fire. She'd just put on a jumper, and I think she probably wouldn't even have been cooking for herself, except she was making food for other people, and she ate what was left over. But she missed Pat awfully while he's away. Everyone in the village was kind to Mary. They always said thank you. They always gave her a smile and a wave, but she didn't really have any friends. So those letters to Pat were so important to her. He'd arrive into the town, like I said, and he'd collect his letter and he'd read what she'd been up to. But there was one year where he was away, and he'd been away just for a few months, 3 months maybe. And he was in the west of Ireland when he arrived into the town, and he went straight to the post office, collected his letter. But when he read the first few lines of the letter, he just welled up and he started to cry. And his instinct was to pack up everything and get home to Mary straight away, because Mary had announced that she was pregnant. She said that they must have been blessed on his last stop off home, but she insisted that he should fight his urge to return to her. She knew her husband so well. She said, I need you to work harder. I need you to stay away for longer, just to, earn enough money so that when you come home, you can take the winter months and spend them with her and their new baby. She knew she'd be okay. She reassured him, and she said, by the time you arrive home, the baby will just be born. But I promise you, she says, I will not name our child. I will simply refer to them as Macushla, my dear, until the day you come back, and we'll wet the baby's head and we'll give them a name. Pat was absolutely delighted with this, and of course he knew that she was right, so he set out a new plan. He decided where he was going to go and change his route and contact some other people, and he put all of this in a letter to Mary, and he sent it off to her. She was delighted to get the letter. She felt reassured that he was taking her advice, and she knew that they would have great times together once the baby was born. Now, because she knew where he was going to go, she was able to keep writing the letters to him. And as the pregnancy went on, Mary was actually looking after herself quite well. She was lighting the fire again. She was cooking for herself. She was really enjoying the pregnancy. And in her letters to Pat, she described the morning sickness and the aches and the pains as if they were gifts from the gods. Well, the pregnancy went fantastic, and Pat was getting on great. And in fact, the baby was born. Pat was due home soon, so when the baby was born, Mary was getting used to all of this, She was absolutely delighted. The baby was born, beautiful, healthy baby boy. And it was the night before Pat was due to arrive home. And the baby was just a few weeks old at this stage. And Mary was pottering around the house, getting everything ready. She wasn't a big drinker, but she'd taken a bottle of poitín out from under the sink, and she'd laid it on the table with 2 glasses for Pat to return the next day. And as she promised, they'd wet the baby's head and give the child a name. But she was cooking and she was cleaning, and the fire was roaring. And as she moved from one room into the front room and walked by the fire, she was almost taken aback by the feel of the heat against the back of her leg. She turned around and she looked at the fire, and it was beautiful. The flames were dancing and crackling and sparking, but Mary realized she couldn't hear anything. She stomped her foot on the ground, but there was no noise, and she slapped the wall, but no noise. She couldn't hear her own breath. She tried to speak, but there was no noise, and still she looked at the fire, and not a sound. Now, Mary had experienced some things since the pregnancy, little ailments and unusual pains, and she thought maybe this, was something like that, only temporary. But she thought about the baby upstairs. She'd gotten used to the baby's noise, but now she couldn't hear anything, and she was worried that if the baby was crying, she wouldn't know. So she quietly and calmly crept up the stairs and made her way to the little bedroom. When she looked into the bedroom, she saw the crib in front of the window with the moonlight spilling in through the glass, and she could see the blanket in the crib just rising and falling and rising and falling, and everything was perfect. Now, I don't know if you've ever been around babies before, but babies are amazing. She wanted to go over and just check that it was okay, maybe tuck it in a little bit. So she went over, and its little face basked in the moonlight, its little chubby cheeks and its lips just puckering. And as she tucked the blanket in around it, she felt something hard. She reached into the blanket and she pulled out a little tumbler, a little glass. Now, it said she'd taken out the glasses and the poutine from under the sink, but she hadn't put it into the crib. Then she started thinking, baby brain, maybe it fell out of my apron. And as she took the glass and turned and was leaving the room, from behind her she heard the voice say, "Mammy. Oh, Mammy, you're so cruel. Why are you stealing my glass? Why are you taking my poutine? I'm dying of thirst." Mary was frozen to the spot in fear. The voice coming from behind her, she knew it wasn't her baby, it wasn't her child. No, this was something else. A changeling. The good folk, the she, had stolen away her baby and replaced it with this awful creature. Growing up in rural Ireland, Mary had heard the story. She knew what to do. She knew she had to stay calm. So she turned to the creature in the crib with the glass in her hand and said, "No, Macushla, my dear, I'm just going downstairs to fill your glass because it's empty." Well, the creature just hissed at her. Its skin yellowed, its lips grey, and the hair wet and matted across its little forehead. It called her the most vile names and screamed after her as she left the room and walked down the stairs. She walked down the stairs and into the front room. Towards a table, she walked by the fire and she felt that intense heat again against her leg. And as she turned and looked at it, she saw the flames and the crackling. She could hear the fire roaring, and suddenly she was aware of her heart beating in her own chest and all of the noise. And she knew the voice she just heard upstairs was very, very real. But when she looked at the fire, she saw the iron, the poker, just resting up against the heart. And she knew that the fairy folk didn't like iron, so she took the metal, she stuck it down into the coals, leaving it there, hoping for it to get red hot quickly. The whole time the creature was still calling down the stairs, and Mary just shouted back up saying that she was struggling opening the poutine and that she was just going to fill the glass and she'd be back up very, very soon. Well, with a shaky hand, she filled the glass and she took it. The poker was just ready and she put it behind her back, hidden, holding it in her hand tightly as she walked up the stairs and into the front room again. She saw the creature standing upright, its body twisted and deformed, staring at her, and while the moonlight came in from behind it, she could still see its eyes glowing yellow. She reassured, says, "Here, I have your poutine for you." But as she walked over towards the creature in the crib, she was so terrified and so nervous that she dropped the glass. It slipped from her fingers and it hit the wooden floorboards and shattered, the poutine going everywhere. The creature screamed and Mary just pulled the poker out from behind her back and she ran towards it, just swinging it, but the creature burst back through the window. Shattered glass hit the ground and the house shook as the creature hit the ground like a ton of coal. And Mary dropped the poker to the ground, rushed over towards the window, and there was no sign of it apart from the screaming far off in the distance. When Mary turned back around, she saw that the poker hit the ground where the poutine had spilt, and it burst into flames in front of her eyes, smoke and flames filling the room quickly, and she ran to go around it. From behind her at the crib, she heard her baby crying. She ran back to the crib, but just as she got to it, the crying stopped and the crib was empty. And suddenly the crying was coming from the far end of the room where the dresser was. And she ran over, pulling open the drawers, and again the crying stopped and now was coming from over from the wardrobe. Every part of the room Mary ran to was empty. But the crying would just come from somewhere else, and Mary wouldn't leave without her baby. And the smoke and the flames got too much. The next morning, Pat arrived back, coming through the village on his horse and cart, his bag on his back filled to the brim with letters from Mary. He noticed that the village was empty and quiet, and something in him was unsettled. He knew something was wrong, and as he came to his little parcel of land, he saw the small crowd gathered at the edge. He got down off the cart, and as he walked towards it, trotted towards it, just walking fast, two of the men turned around and they just stopped and they grabbed him by the shoulder and said, "Pat, we're so sorry. There was a horrible accident last night. The house, everything's gone. Mary's gone. There's nothing but rubble and smoke." Everyone was looking at Pat. He fell to his knees and he sobbed the most horrible cries. The bag falling off his shoulders, the letters spilling out into the mud on the ground. And then Pat looked up. He looked at the two men and he said, "What about my baby?" Well, when he said that, he immediately heard the whispers. The people were like, "What baby? Did you know Mary was pregnant?" "What? She wasn't pregnant." Well, Pat knew. He got up off the ground, the men helped him to his feet and he shrugged their hands off his shoulders, and without the bag he just walked towards the house, walked towards the charred remains, and he walked right by the house, and he just kept on walking because there was nothing left for Pat. Good night. I want to say a little extra about that story. You see, while that story has such love and joy in it at the start, it's an incredibly sad story. And you'd say it's just a story. But that woman was engulfed in loneliness. And while she seemed to enjoy everything, I think she got lost in herself. And maybe she was pregnant and maybe she'd lost a child, but I think writing those letters just created a world that she longed for, that she really wanted, and she felt great writing the letters to her husband, and it brought him such joy as well. And I don't think Mary was particularly well, and I think that the night before her husband arrived home, when she realized, when she had to face the reality that her husband was coming back to those lies, and that the loss he'd feel would be so real, she couldn't cope with it. And I don't think the fire was an accident.